In the weeks between the British and German Grand Prix, the banking world was rocked by the leaks of a damning report into the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, BCCI. Founded in Pakistan in 1972, BCCI had become a major player in world finance, the seventh largest private bank in the world, registered in Luxembourg and with head offices in Karachi and London. It had long had a reputation in the financial industry for being badly regulated with impenetrable internal accounting, and there were persistent rumours that it secretly held a controlling share in First American Bank, while law enforcement and intelligence communities nicknamed it the Bank of Crooks and Criminals International, as it was widely believed to be laundering money for and lending money to an array of less traditional customers such as Saddam Hussein, Manuel Noriega, the Medellin drugs cartel, and the Abu Nidal terrorist group. A sting operation had led to a trial and a guilty plea over money laundering in 1990, but little had actually happened except BCCI being forced to pull out of Florida. But in March 1991, the Bank of England asked Prix to do an investigation, the so-called Sandstorm report, which had also involved MI5, proving that the bank had directly dealt with the Abu Nidal group, which was the first time the bank had been directly connected to terrorism. Boxer Mike Tyson was arrested for the rape of the 18-year-old Desiree Washington, Miss Black America, on the 19th of July. Tyson had been a megastar of boxing through the late 1980s, but by 1990 he'd lost the undisputed heavyweight championship to a relative unknown, Buster Douglas, among rumours that all was not well in his personal life, his training had taken a nosedive, and he was addicted to cocaine. The trial was scheduled to take place in Marion County, Indiana, early in 1992, and would result in him being convicted and jailed for 6 years. In India, the Finance Minister Manmohan Singh announced a new industrial policy which the Rao government intended as the start of a complete overhaul of the country's economy, moving away from a centrally planned economy to a free market model, incentivising foreign investment, privatising the big state monopolies, and removing licensing restrictions in the vast majority of industries, alongside promoting both exports and imports. Not everyone was happy with the idea, with the opposition calling it a budget set by the IMF and arguing that its provisions would hit smaller farmers and the lower and middle classes. With India having a minority government, what they could do would largely come down to Rao's ability to persuade and cajole the other parties to support his measures. The weekend before the German Grand Prix, a private test was arranged at Hockenheim by Fokker, and on the Friday, Senna had a massive crash when he had a left rear puncture at nearly 200 miles an hour, 320 kilometres an hour. His nose lifted, and the car took off briefly before smashing into a tyre barrier, rolling and disintegrating. The Brazilian was taken to Mannheim Hospital and kept in overnight, with some bruising to neck and shoulders, but once he'd recovered from the shock, he affirmed that he was fine and would be driving in the German Grand Prix, adding that, "Risks are part of my job. If I didn't accept them, I wouldn't be able to drive competitively." Between this, his big smash in Monaco, and his jet ski accident, poor Ayrton must have been feeling a bit knocked around, and headed off for a bit of R&R in Portugal before the race. A week after being introduced to the press at the British Grand Prix, Nigel Mansell's protégé Paul Warwick was involved in an accident of his own. Leading round 5 of the British Formula 3000 Championship at Alton Park, a front wishbone broke at a right-hander, sending him head-on into the barrier at 140 miles an hour, 230 kph, demolishing the Reynard chassis and throwing Paul from the car. He was airlifted to hospital, but died of his injuries that evening. The race had been stopped after his accident, and as he was leading, he was posthumously awarded the victory, taking him to 5 wins from 5. He was just 22. So as the teams arrived in Germany, Nigel Mansell was still deeply affected, and wasn't talking about the incident either to media or others in the team. Williams had recently completed their new full-size wind tunnel, something Adrian Newey had asked for, and sold their old quarter-scale one to Lotus, who set Argentine Enrique Scalabroni to work designing their 1992 Challenger using it, with the team also announcing the return of Nigel Stepney as racing director. They also had a new driver, with Johnny Herbert honouring his Formula 3000 commitments in Japan. Local driver Michael Bartels took the wheel in exchange for a substantial pile of Deutschmarks. The car had also quite some more sponsor stickers too, with Liqui Moly, Tommy Hilfiger and Tic Tacs among others, ruining the lines of the livery but helping out with the bank balance no end. Interestingly, 2 of the sponsors in fact were direct competitors, with Liqui Moly and BP both producing fuels and lubricants. Car number 12, Michael Bartels. Born in the town of Plettenberg in northwest Germany, son of German hill climb legend Willy Bartels, Michael began karting in the early 80s and won the championship in 1985 before going into Formula Ford 1600 and winning the title at his first attempt in 1986. In 1988 he moved up again to German F3. He spent 2 years in that series, coming 4th and 5th in the championships that were won respectively by Joe Winkelhock and Karl Wendlinger. He'd been taken under the wing of manager Keke Rosberg, and despite his relative lack of results in F3, was regarded as one of the coming men of Austro-German motorsport, along with Michael Schumacher, Karl Wendlinger and Heinz-Harald Frentzen. A move to International F3000 continued his frustrations, the Cobra Motorsports team turning out to be not on the pace, and Bartels, with a rotating cast of teammates, Richard Dean, Giovanna Amati and Alain Menu, failed to make much impact. Bartels finished the year with just 1 point at the final race to add to Dean's 2 points from the first. 1990 was even more frustrating for Bartels, who began the season with GA Motorsport, then switched to First Racing after failing to qualify for race 1. He did at least qualify for the next 3 races, finishing 8th and 15th with the DNF in between, but his star seemed to be waning when Lotus pitched up looking for a substitute driver for Germany and Hungary, and his sponsors were willing to arrange the drive to get him on the radar and give him some valuable experience. He thus became the first driver in F1 to represent the United Germany. Satoru Nakajima had announced that he was retiring at the end of the season. Now 38 years old, he was becoming tired of constantly travelling to and from Japan, had never settled in Europe and wanted more family time. He'd also never quite been physically strong enough for the demands of an F1 car, which was why he always went better in the wet when speeds were lower, and hated street circuits with their tight high-G corners. He'd given Ken Tyrrell and his son Bob, who was taking on more of the work at the team, plenty of notice to replace him, and names were already being thrown around, including McLaren test driver Alan McNish and Michael Schumacher, a potential German link for sponsors Braun. Less goodwill was forthcoming at Footwork, where Alex Caffey was back in the cockpit, but things were still tetchy between him and his team boss Jackie Oliver, which wasn't helped when Alex asked for his bonus for the 4 races he'd missed, and he wasn't invited to come to the Hockenheim test. All smiles at LaRousse, though, where the boss had returned from Japan with a big sponsorship package from Yoshitoshi Doi, the head of the Central Park Consortium, already sponsoring the Modena Lamborghini team. Their boss, Carlo Petruccio, meanwhile, was said to be talking to Adrian Reynard about a merger. Reynard himself thought to be preparing an F1 works team, while the Modena team were desperately in search of a rescuer. No such worries at McLaren, but the team are still having their own problems. Shell have brought a new fuel, which ought to be more efficient and prevent any repeat of Senna running dry at Silverstone, and while Henri Durand works on a new aero package for 1992, Ron Dennis had promised an impatient and bruised Senna that the team's new semi-automatic gearbox will be ready for the next race in Hungary. Here, to offset Williams' handling advantage, the MP46 would feature a more cambered rear wing, which ironically seemed to have increased fuel consumption. The new gang for pre-qualifying headed out on Friday morning, with Martin Brundle setting the pace over a second ahead of second-place Tarquini, with Alboreto third and Blundell taking the last place, 0.4 seconds ahead of Guiar, who had another engine failure, with the rusty Alex Caffey missing out alongside Barbazza and Chavez. Friday qualifying proper then was dominated by Nigel Mansell, half a second ahead of Berger, and then on Saturday morning Eric Comas had a terrifying crash at the Ostkurve. He said afterwards that he'd always put off getting in contact with Philippe Straff, but knowing he'd got away with it in a big way today, he'd make a point of visiting his less fortunate compatriot. Most drivers, including Eric, improved their times on Saturday afternoon, but nobody could touch Mansell, who took pole, the team's 5th in a row, with Senna improving to second, 0.187 seconds behind, with Berger and Patrese on row 2, then the Ferraris nearly 2 seconds off Mansell and 1.6 seconds behind Patrese on row 3. De Cesaris celebrated his Friday lie-in by putting his Jordan 7th, ahead of the Benettons with the same engine, and with Martini rounding out the top 10. The Tyrrells were bang in the middle of the field, just ahead of Brundle, the Dellaras 18th and 20th after their own escape from PQ, Hakkinen was 23rd after demolishing his car on Friday, so much for that new sponsor money, alongside Nicola Larini, the Modena team also delighted to make race day again, with the 2 French Erics bringing up the rear, Ligier driver edging Alboreto out by just 8 tenths. Bartel struggled manfully with the Lotus on his debut and was at least faster than Tarquini and Van der Poel. Following Comas's accident and after his own in Mexico in similar circumstances, Senna called at the driver's briefing for the tyre walls at chicanes to be replaced with cones to eliminate the possibility of hitting them and rolling over. Tempers got heated between race director Roland Brunschreider, Senna and Jean-Marie Balestre, the exchange making its way into the Senna movie released in 2011, as Balestre proclaimed,
"The best decision is my decision."
Before announcing a vote among the drivers, which unanimously agreed on the cones, and Brunschreider had his orders. The Automobilclub von Deutschland, the circuit owners, were already being warned that the track needed improvements, though with the customary huge turnout, a record 120,000 this year, it seemed unlikely that the track was in any danger of losing the race back to the Nürburgring. So with all that done, it was time to line up for the race itself. Most drivers were starting out on soft C compound tyres or their Pirelli equivalent, except for Alesi, who opted for the harder Bs and was hoping to run non-stop, as it was obvious from qualifying that the Ferraris couldn't hope to beat Williams or McLaren in a straight race. Prost, meanwhile, was trying the opposite approach: soft tyres and minimal wing to get the best top speed. In the warm-up, the FW14s were speed trapped at 338 km an hour, 210 miles an hour, with the Ferraris at 302, 206, and the McLarens at 326, 202.5, so it seemed to be working, at least partially. There had also been a series of drivers reporting cut tyres up the Ost curve, and Senna and Berger, on the behalf of the rest of the drivers, went out to inspect it and get it swept before the race began. It was looking like it would be a scorching race, with engine overheating, driver overheating and tyre overheating all potential factors in the race, and indeed Ivan Capelli missed the warm-up with a stomach complaint, and though he would take the start, he might well not make it all the way. So with Suzuki starting from the pit lane in the spare Lola after a technical glitch, the remaining 25 cars lined up on the grid for the start, and it was time to go. Mansell slewed right away from the lights to block Senna, who was also passed by Berger, with Prost, Patrese and Alesi following along, while the unfortunate Nicola Larini was nudged into a spin before the first corner, and his race came to a premature end. Partway around lap 1, Comas and Bernard had a minor coming together which sent the Lola down the escape road. But up front, it was Mansell leading Senna, Berger, Prost, Alesi, Patrese and De Cesaris, with the two Benettons right behind. Patrese swiftly got back in front of Alesi, as his teammate Mansell was already beginning to leave Berger behind, a 2-second gap by the end of lap 2, as off-camera, Häkkinen collected one of those new chicane marker cones under his front wing and had to come in to have it extracted. Alesi on his harder tyres was dropping behind Patrese, but still building up a gap from Piquet, who had overtaken De Cesaris to go back up to 7th, and Prost meanwhile was climbing all over the back of Senna's McLaren, as he seemed to be dropping off Berger, with Patrese close behind the Ferrari and hoping for another Prost-Senna collision. And whenever Prost dropped back from Senna slightly, Patrese was attacking him, giving him no respite. The Pirelli runners were all struggling with their tyres, and Piquet lost 7th to De Cesaris again, while Nakajima peeled in for a new set as early as lap 6 of the 45. Berger had now pulled away from Senna a bit, and there was a fierce three-way scrap between Senna, Prost and Patrese over 3rd through 5th places. Alesi was still in touch though, and if the three ahead of him all had to change tyres and he didn't, he could be in a very good position indeed. Eric Bernard was the first retirement other than Larini, the crown wheel and pinion the culprit as they had been in Silverstone, and still Senna, Prost and Patrese were running close together, with Berger not too far ahead and Alesi not too far behind. Martini dropped out of 10th place after his engine dropped oil on his own rear wheels and he exited the track at the Ost curve. Morbidelli and the other Minardi meanwhile had worked his way up to 13th by lap 15, 1/3 distance, when his own Ferrari V12 expired. Not a good day for the men from Faenza. Piquet made his tyre stop just before that, rejoining 12th. Several of the Pirelli runners had changed early, but this was just at the start of the expected pit stop window for the Goodyear runners, and a lap later Berger came in for his change, nearly catching the McLaren team on the hop. A cross-threaded wheel nut on the front right saw the Austrian stationary for 16 seconds, dropping him back to 11th between Capelli and Boutsen. So the Senna-Prost-Piquet battle was now on for 2nd place, as the Ferrari and McLaren crews both got ready in neighbouring pits. At the end of lap 17, Senna and Prost peeled in at the same time. Both crews excelled themselves, but it was Senna back out in front as Patrese stormed through into 2nd and Alesi into 3rd. Next time round it was Mansell's turn with a 17-second lead, a good stop putting him out in 3rd behind Patrese and Alesi. Patrese would still need to stop, but Mansell would have to get back past Alesi on the road, assuming that those B compound tyres lasted the race. Ricciardo was in next, and another great stop spat him back out on the track in the tyre tracks of Senna and Prost still hard at it, and that 3-car battle resumed where it had left off. Mansell was tearing lumps out of a Lazy's lead while we watched the entertaining battle, as Senna continued fending off Prost, making his McLaren as wide as humanly possible. On lap 22, Prix took Prost for fourth at the first chicane, as Hakkinen pulled in with the dud engine, no joy for Lotus this time either. And back on the track, Mansell had got past a Lazy without too much trouble or any TV coverage, and then Prix snuck past Senna too at the start of the stadium. Senna seemed to be having some trouble, in fact, as Prost was now all over him again. Berger, meanwhile, had recovered to sixth and was some 8 seconds behind Prost and gaining. Once past, Mansell fairly left a Lazy in the dust, pulling out 3 seconds on just his first lap past, with Prix now putting his foot down to reel in Jean's 13-second lead at 2 seconds a lap and setting a new lap record, which was promptly broken by Mansell again. The Benettons, meanwhile, were plugging away together in 8th and 9th, still suffering with their Pirelli tyres as half-distance came and went. Prost dropped off Senna as his engine was starting to overheat a bit and he needed a break himself, as both lapped Pirot, and soon Piquet's frustrating weekend came to an end as his engine gave out and he parked up in the woods. So as he began the long walk back, the race had settled down a little, with Patrese' pursuit of a Lazy the main interest on track, at least until Senna and Prost renewed hostilities. Patrese caught a Lazy who put up a brave fight, weaving a little on the straight, but he wasn't going to be able to keep the Williams behind for long, and Ricciardo was through at the first chicane without too much drama. At about the same time, Prost began attacking Senna again with just 8 laps to go. Impatient to get past, Prost lunged at the entrance to the first chicane, but Senna shut the door, forcing Prost off down the escape road, and as he frantically toggled the downshift paddle, his gearbox waved the white flag, and the engine stalled, putting Prost out, furious once again with Senna's driving. Remarkably, he was actually the first of the top 6 on the grid to retire. So with the laps ticking down to the finish, Mansell and Patrese were looking at a 1-2 finish, with a Lazy third, Senna fourth, and apparently unable to make much of an impression on the remaining Ferrari. Berger was up to 5th, and only 5 seconds behind Senna now, with De Cesaris and Gachot 6th and 7th, with the Belgian fighting off Moreno and Boutsen. By now, the only question seemed to be whether anyone would have a last-minute breakdown, and if Berger would hold station behind Senna or go for 4th in the closing laps. Mansell came round to begin his final lap, in formation with the Brundle brothers in the Brabhams, now 2 laps back, but still going. And then suddenly Senna was pulling off, out of fuel again, as Nigel Mansell took the checkered flag with Brundle and Blundell right behind to take his 3rd win in a row, and to be the first Brit to win the German Grand Prix since James Hunt at that race at the Nürburgring in 1976. But unlike Silverstone, Senna hadn't lapped enough other cars and he dropped out of the points, finally classified as 7th. Patrese took 2nd, a Lazy a fine 3rd, Berger 4th, and those Green Jordans 5th and 6th, their 2nd double points finish of the year and their 5th points finish in a row. It was Berger's turn to play taxi this time, taking a still unwell Ivan Capelli home after the Italian had stopped out in the forest after 36 laps with a dud Ilmore. Again. So, Mansell closed up to 8 points behind Senna in the title race, with Patrese also pulling 7 points clear of Prost in 3rd place after the Professor's retirement, and Berger taking 5th from Piquet. And 16 points for another 1-2 meant that Williams took the lead in the Constructors' Championship by a single point, with Ferrari some distance behind McLaren on 33 points.